Steph. I'm the manager here. We're so pleased to have Annelise Orleck with us tonight. She's the author of this book, We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise Orleck is a professor of history at Dartmouth College, and she's the author of 5 books on the history of U.S. women, politics, immigration, and activism. Marian Hirsch of Columbia University had this to say about the book. From hundreds of small stories of vulnerability and resistance, Annelise Orleck skillfully weaves an inspiring global narrative of protest, coalition, and empowerment, a narrative essential to students of oral history, testimony and witness, and activism in the face of a global economy of indifference and disposability. This book truly is a tapestry of stories from all over the world. It's compelling, heartbreaking, beautiful, and really impossible to forget. So please join me in welcoming Annelise Orleck to Water Street Bookstore.
Thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it. It's a raw March night, as we were discussing, so I appreciate your coming out. And for my friends from the Penn Group, thanks for sitting with me yet again. So I guess I wanted to start by just giving you a little bit of sense of where this book, this book got its start, and then maybe I can do some reading or talking, but also we can have a conversation, because I'm curious to know the reasons why this topic drew you and why you came out here tonight. The book got its start in a couple of ways. As a labor historian, I was involved in organizing the 100th anniversary commemorations of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Some of you know what that was. It was a terrible disaster in New York City in 1911 at a garment factory off Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village, where 146 young workers died in the middle of the city, so everyone saw them. Many of them jumped in from the flames. And it changed a lot about how the way this government deals with workplace conditions. So around the 100th anniversary, there was a lot of desire to commemorate, and the narrative was all, oh, things are better now, right? Things are so much better now, we're gonna look at the bad old days, right? But in fact, of course, what many people realized, including, and we'll keep going forward, we can make this go, well, we'll get to Kalpana Actor in a bit, including a Bangladeshi garment worker today by the name of Kalpana Actor. And Kalpana Actor decided that none of us really knew where our clothes were made, right? None of us really understood the conditions behind these wonderful $5 and $10, shirts and skirts that started flooding our cities. And so she took all of the energy and the publicity around the 100th anniversary of the fire, and she said, I want to use that to try to help people in the world see what work is like for garment workers today. So she walked up the steps to the stage of the Great Hall of the People in Cooper Union in Lower Manhattan, which had been the site of many uprisings, labor uprisings, and abolitionists had spoken there, and famous Native American chiefs had spoken about the slaughter of the Western tribes in the 1860s and 70s, and women suffragists had spoken there, and a great garment strike had begun there, and called the Uprising of the 20,000, which was the biggest women's strike to that time, 1909, 1910. So Kalpana Actor walked up 100 years later onto that stage, and she said, in Bangladesh, it's not 2011, it's 1911. And that really struck me and became one of the organizing principles of the research that I did. And what I found is, it's not just 1911 in Bangladesh, it's 1911 all over the world for workers. So that's one theme of this book, is how we ended up going back 100 years. And I was just talking to these guys over dinner, and that's hard to imagine, right? Because we think of ourselves, everything is going forward. But as a result of the changes of globalization and everyone becoming a contract worker, the so-called gig economy, nobody's an employee anymore, nobody's protected by labor legislation. As a result of these kinds of changes in the world, that's where the title of the book came. I was interviewing a bunch of Fight for 15 activists in Tampa, Florida, and I was surprised by who came to the table. Who came to the table were fast food workers. Home health care workers had to Skype in because they were too busy to actually get out of the, where they took care of people. Their charges were too frail for them to leave. And college professors, adjunct college professors. And I said, this is a different kind of working class solidarity than I have seen before. This is interesting. So I asked them how they came to band together. And Keegan Shepard, who is a graduate student in history and who was among those on many campuses, graduate students do a lot of work for free. College professors do a lot of work for free, paid, course by course, under these short-term contracts. And he said, well, they try to tell us that our advanced degrees will make us somehow safe, and that if we're just quiet, we'll get those good tenure track jobs like I have. I'm a dinosaur. My kind of job doesn't exist anymore. Try to tell us we'll get those jobs and we'll have the American dream. He said, but you know what? It's a lie to keep us quiet. The truth is we're all fast food workers now. And they said, we're honored to organize with the fast food workers. So one of the people sitting at that table was Blue Rainier. And Blue Rainier is a 26-year-old McDonald's worker from Tampa. He's actually from North Carolina, but he moved to Florida hoping to, have a slightly better life. And Blue Rainier also made me understand that these workers who were beginning to organize have a really sophisticated sense of the global economy. And the reason for that is because he works for McDonald's. He understands that he works with a group that has come to call each other McBrothers, McDonald's workers from around the world. This photograph is actually from a New York City march, and it illustrates another point, which is the extent to which he's wearing the I Can't Breathe shirt, right, which were the last words of street vendor Eric Garner in Staten Island, New York, when he was murdered by the New York Police Department. And that's one piece of it, right, is the overlapping of these movements, the living wage movement, the movement against police violence. But Blue is showing, he's showing these scars on his arm. And the scars on his arm were a gateway to him for understanding the global economy. In the summer of 2015, he got this letter which really surprised him. He opened it up, this guy making $8.05 an hour, working for McDonald's, maybe he had a year of college. And it's an invitation to testify before the federal Senate in Brazil. Because the senators in Brazil realized, because their workers were organizing, that they had come to understand how dangerous this work was, how it was driving down wages for people all across the country, because McDonald's was the second largest employer in Brazil. And they had the suspicion that it was doing that all over the world. So they invited fast food workers from all over the world to testify before the Brazil Senate that summer. And Blue went, and he met McDonald's workers from Japan, and from Seoul, South Korea, and from the Philippines. And they rolled up their sleeves, and they all had burns in exactly the same places. They put their arms next to each other, and he said it kind of gave him chills, because he understood that they were all in the same situation, right, working for this transnational corporation. They all had 90 seconds to turn around their orders. They all had to reach over boiling oil to do it. And so that is the other piece of this, that you have workers beginning to understand themselves not as parts of just the one little McDonald's they might work at down the block, right, but as part of a global uprising, and that's what I found. Okay, so that's where all this started, and let's see if we can go on, and yeah. Another piece of this global uprising. This is Chim Sitar and Pao Chimoni in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. A couple of young girls, like Blue, in their 20s. And they were in a great mood because they had come off of successfully organizing a union of 4,000 hotel maids in the casino on Diamond Island in the middle of Phnom Penh. Used to be a fisherman's village, and now it's this like casino that's glass and steel, and it wouldn't be at a place in Vegas. And the story that they had to tell is twofold. One is they couldn't do it without this international behind them, right? They have a banner behind them of the Global Housekeepers Weeks of Action. Every year, for the past 5 years, hotel housekeepers have walked out for a week all over the world. In countries, and there you can see pictures of them in the Maldives. You can see pictures of them in Abuja in Nigeria. You can see pictures of them in Islamabad, right? You can see all over the world. And again, for them, not only was it important to band together with workers all over the world, but it was also important for them to make their work visible, right? Because any of you have stayed in a hotel room, and as Massimo Frattini, who's an organizer in Milan, who's organized these global weeks of action by these hotel housekeepers, said, everybody walks out of a hotel room in the morning, and you come back, and it's so nice, and you think that a fairy has come, right? It's magic. The hotel room is so beautifully clean and neat and wonderful. And he said that invisibility is really central to the ability to exploit workers, right? Because we don't see what goes on in that hotel room when we're not there. In fact, we don't see that hotel housekeepers work in pain more often than any other kind of profession. Because it is this constant on your knees, stretching over beds, working with toxic solvents. So these guys, in order to organize that union, had to make themselves visible, and that's the other piece of this movement, is making the invisible visible, and that's true of farm workers, right? The berries just appear beautifully in our store. They're so nice and pretty. Suddenly we have berries 12 months a year. It's true of these hotel workers. It's true of garment workers, right, who have had to come out in public and show us what they do. So let me stop for a minute. I can go on, but I did want to get a sense from people here about why you came out, and maybe I'll read you a couple of stories from the book. Why this topic? Why tonight? Andrew?
So our group came out because in terms of issues that will directly affect the quality of life for young people, this is obviously one that if it continues to go unaddressed could worsen exponentially, and if it is addressed could make lives for countless people better. So it seems like an obvious one to want to be more educated about at the very least and involved in in an ideal world.
That's great.
Countless lives globally, not just on a local effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking globally is something we can do now, and that these folks can do more successfully than ever before. One thing that I was able to do was reach people to interview all over the world through social media. I literally Facebooked people that I had never met before, and people wrote me back. And we began communicating. It's also how they organize, right? How are you going to get fast food workers to walk out of McDonald's as they have every year for the past 4 years now, in 40 countries on 6 continents? Right? You can do it because of social media. So this thinking globally is something we need to do. It's something that this movement has been able to do. Other thoughts about why people came out? Why this topic? Yeah.
Well, I'm really interested to hear more about the oral history component of this, and how you reached out to people through social media, and also if you yourself became an activist as part of this, and being a historian activist. Yeah, I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. One book.
I had just read a book on Amazon and workers working in there, on the floor, and just really long hours, and this kind of stuff interests me, and so I wanted to come out and hear what you had to say about it.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, it's interesting. I just in English class read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So that was sort of a big awakening for me in terms of working class issues, and it's so relevant politically now. I thought it would be interesting to find more about.
Yes, interesting. Yeah, there again, right? Upton Sinclair, 100 years ago. Right, 100 years ago, the conditions that, American historians like me teach about and say, oh, it's all, that was the bad old days. And then we got progressive legislation, and things got better. And one of the things that these Philippine workers that I look at, maybe we can, where are they? This is Kalpana Actor, the Bangladeshi leader who I told you about. veteran farm worker activist Maria Elena Durazo. Here, let's stay with Joanna, Sister Nice Coronation, who is a 27-year-old activist who set herself the small task of simultaneously dismantling capitalism and patriarchy, because she said you can't dismantle one without dismantling the other. And she's very, very serious. She's smiling here, but she's very, very serious. She's got her work cut out for her. She knows what she's got to do, and she's doing it. But one of the things that they're campaigning on is something that they call contractualization, right? And that's this other piece. And what contractualization is what we call the gig economy. Right? It's this idea that we passed all those laws, right? Workers fought and died, for overtime laws, for maximum hours laws, for minimum wage laws, for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and versions of that around the world, including the Philippines, which as an American colony had labor laws almost identical to ours. But what contractualization does is it says nobody's an employee. Everybody is an independent contractor, and as such, surprise, surprise, you're not covered by overtime laws. You're not covered by minimum wage laws. You don't get a pension. And so what happened is that, as these young people are realizing, is that all of these rights that legally they should have been taken away by this new economy. And so all of this, your question about oral history raises this question: why would they talk to me? And the reason I think that they were willing to talk to me, and I talked to a lot of people. I talked to 140 people. Come, we got chairs right here. I think that the reason they talked to me, and I've had this experience in the past, is that I asked. And for a lot of folks who are low-wage workers, in a previous book, Storming Caesar's Palace, I wrote about welfare moms, and these are all people who are used to, as one of those welfare moms said, being the ones who everyone's always demanding things of, right? And so to be the ones who are speaking, right, and the ones who are making demands is a very empowering thing, and to have their stories recorded is a way of helping expand on their demands, but also in places like Cambodia, which you just saw a picture of, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. It literally could keep these folks alive, because being an activist, you take your life in your hands. And I don't know how much you followed about what's going on with the Duterte regime now in the Philippines, the Hun Sen regime in Cambodia, Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. These folks are literally taking their life in their hands, and getting their words out around the world makes them just a little bit safer, right? Because the world is watching. Yes?
Does that also protect them from being fired when they walk out?
The bottom line is nothing protects them from being fired when they walk out. But one of the things, because that's contract labor. So one of the things that they're trying to win in the Philippines, really interesting, again, you have to pass these laws that were passed 100 years ago. They're going back and they're trying to get laws passed that say, if you work for more than 4 months for any employer, you're an employee. You're covered by labor laws. Because I spoke to people who had been switched every 4 months. They'd been McDonald's employees for, one guy, a dozen years, and every 4 months they'd switch him to a different McDonald's, so that he was always a temporary worker, never had seniority, right? Never was eligible for a pension. So there aren't a lot of protections. But you make a really important point. One of the things that these guys have done that's been really interesting in their use of social media is they have become the media. Right? They don't have to wait for a newspaper to write about them. They don't have to wait for television footage. They post, they videotape, they post, they use a lot of street theater. There are all these, on the streets, there are all these mock trials of a weeping Ronald McDonald, for labor abuses. And singing and dancing in popular culture has been really, really big. Let's find our choreographer. We'll keep going. Yeah, everybody's having fun. There he is. Leigh Catamon, musical theater major in college in Manila. graduated and he thought, he had a college degree in a place where most people don't. He could have gotten a decent job, but he decided he wanted to put his musical theater degree to some good use. And he started choreographing protests, civil disobedience to popular music. So I want to read you just a little piece of, about what they do. Their alliance of young fast food workers in the Philippines. He's the one who said to me, "This is not your grandmother's revolution. Right? This is something very different." They created a group of fast food workers called the RESPECT, Fast Food Workers Alliance. One of the songs they dance to, of course, is Aretha Franklin's song. And, okay, here we go. And many others as well. So let me give you a little sense of their story. This little chapter is called Respect, Let It Go, 'Cause Baby, You're a Firework, which, if you realize, are titles, bits of pieces from songs. It's a steamy dawn in downtown Manila, already hot, though it's only 6:30. A group of slim young men and women in their teens and 20s file out into the middle of a busy avenue wearing white shirts, black pants, and purple headbands. The strains of Katy Perry's Firework rise from a boombox, heavy on the bass. At other times, they dance to Aretha Franklin's Respect or the Disney theme song Let It Go from the animated hit Frozen. But this is a morning for fireworks. The kids start to dance with verve as perfectly synchronized as a Broadway chorus line. They sing as they move, improvising as they go, riffing on Katy Perry's lyrics in a mix of Tagalog and English, igniting the light inside them, letting it shine, showing the world what they are worth. They shout, strike poses, pump fists, 'cause baby, we are fireworks. Cars roar in from all directions. Drivers honk or tap their fingers through open windows. Motorcycles grind to a halt. Some yell at the dancers to move, but others start to sing along. Then comes the chant, what do we want? Decent jobs, again and again to the beat of the song. Decent jobs for all. It takes forever to get anywhere in Metro Manila. One of the world's most densely populated cities, it is also vast. In 2016, Manila had 13 million people, 23 million if you count suburbs and ring towns. The city center is choked by sprawling, smoky slums that are home to many young activists in the RESPECT Fast Food Workers Alliance. The poorest among them come from what Joanna Bernice Carnation calls danger zones, where tin and cardboard shacks sit below sea level, flooding every time the inevitable rains and typhoons hit. It's a world of mud and sewage, but also of song and dance. Many of the best performers come from Bagang Silangan, a barangay or neighborhood known for high unemployment, but also for excellent dancers, says Leigh Kataman, a 23-year-old choreographer, theater student, and labor organizer. When Carnation and Kataman realized that poor kids were entering dance contests to make money for their families because they couldn't live on what they were making in their regular jobs if they had them, they helped them unionize. And so they created a dancers union of Bagang Silangan Dubs, which was a name that was an allusion to a globally popular genre of electronic dance music that grew out of reggae, hip-hop, and techno. Much of the Philippine workforce is under 30, and jobs are increasingly precarious. That's another thing that this book does, is talk about the rise of the global precariat. The age of the proletariat, the industrial worker and the permanent job is gone. In its place is the precariat. No job security, no chance for social mobility. Okay, so, yes, they use these young dancers to lead labor protests that draw attention to these issues, and also because the Philippine labor movement was graying and they wanted to attract young people. I was totally nervous my first time to dance in the street, says Dubs member Irene Remontal, but seeing all the people stopped on the overpass and the vehicles watching us, at that moment I felt joy. Dancing for a cause feels great, says a 19-year-old male Dubs member. Before I only danced to brag. Now with Dubs, I dance for a purpose. Decent and secure jobs, upholding women's rights. These issues have impact on my and my family's lives. So Kataman, talks about how in the Philippines, as all over the world, right, the labor movement seemed to be dying. Unions seemed to be dying. No one was joining unions. And the movement there, like this movement that I write about in this book all over, though led by some veterans, like a couple that you saw, is really a young people's movement. He said, we started doing flash mobs to appeal to young people. Does everybody know what a flash mob is? Okay. Some people don't? No? Okay. Somebody want to tell what a flash mob is?
large group of people that dances normally with loud music and lights.
Yeah, but
glow sticks.
they step out kind of spontaneously, right? They step out, you don't expect them. So, and this has become the hallmark of the Philippine movement, right? And you're in a shopping mall, and all of a sudden, people start coming out of these different stores, right? And then the next thing you know, a couple of people are dancing, and then 10 people, and then 20, and they're pulling off their shirts to reveal some slogan underneath while they're singing and dancing. And the Filipino activists have turned this into a total art form. Instead of carrying protest signs, same old, we perform. When people start to listen, clap their hands, maybe sing along, we know we are succeeding. The young dancers all understand we are not performing simply for the sake of performance, although they like to perform, but for a larger purpose. So he said, before we take youth to a mobilization, we educate them about wage theft, about sexual harassment, about labor rights. What is the impact on your life, on your community, on your family? And they get it. They say, wow, I have been cheated. My mother, my brother has been cheated for so many years. Then they know not just where they are going to dance, but why. So I said the music has been a part of many protest movements. Young Filipino workers have turned musical theater into a protest art, so much so that Manilans have gotten used to these scenes that appear to be ripped out of Glee or some other TV musical. On May 14th, 2014, a day of global action, teenage fast food workers line danced through the streets of downtown Manila, singing to the music from Disney's animated hit Frozen. So it's mostly these teenage girls in this long line dance going through this densely populated city. Singing loudly, they urged workers, let it go, don't hold back anymore, let it go, turn away, slam the door. They made lyrics up as they danced, holding hands. They pulled workers from behind counters into the streets, into the strike, right? This is not a way you think of a strike beginning. They sang about rising as a new dawn broke. They celebrated the end of fear. Here I stand in the light of day. They sang, if that brought a raging storm, that was fine. McDonald's never bothered me anyway. On International Women's Day 2015, one of the biggest of their flash mobs ever, 5,000 trade unionist women danced in front of the presidential Malacanang Palace, singing Helen Reddy's 1972 hit, I Am Woman. You're not going to hear that around here anymore, but that's a kind of interesting side light, is that 70s R&B is the soundtrack of this Philippine protest music, which is really interesting. It's not accidental that they chose for their name Aretha Franklin's 1967 mega hit, R-E-S-P-E-C-T. And he's finishing his dance. He's been chanting here. I'll tell you what it means to me. Respect is the name that is the word you hear again and again. Living wage matters. Sexual harassment and sexual violence matters. Not having people thrown off their lands. The last part of the book is about farmers and farm workers globally organizing, because since 2008 we've seen this vast changing of hands of lands, particularly in Africa and Asia, also in Latin America and even in Europe, and these consolidation of small farms into these really big farms. And for everybody, all of these issues really matter. But at bottom, I was really struck by how many people talk about respect. This group is called Respect. You saw the picture of the fast food workers in New York. Everybody deserves respect. The Walmart workers organization in this country is called Our Walmart, Organization United for Respect at Walmart. So it's not quantifiable in the way that wages are, but it is really crucial to this humanizing people. Yeah.
What does Duterte do with them politically?
So far, I mean, he has killed one of their activists on the steps of the Union Hall. So at least one has been murdered. The land rights activists have been murdered at a much higher rate. Those who are down in the south, in Mindanao especially, and in the southern islands, the death toll is very high. I could read a piece of that section, but it's a little rough. Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm struck by is how much humor and how much heart and how much courage. That young girl you saw, the two women who organized the 4,000 person union, the president of that union is 27 years old, and she said to me, I could die. I could. She was telling me that she wanted to go to law school, right? That was her ultimate goal. But she said, I know I might die before then. And she said that's actually okay with me. I don't want to, but it's actually okay. In Cambodia, they have a very particular thing that they say, which is that after the Khmer Rouge, they feel like they deserve a real democracy, and they don't feel like they have one. And so there's just incredible courage that people display there and in all of these places. I think yes.
So in this creation of like an international global network, do you find that the people mobilizing through this network are turning increasingly towards like global international solutions, or are they still looking to like their nations, their states to sort of solve, to offer solutions?
They're working on all these fronts. They're working on all those fronts simultaneously. So, people always, because I write about poor people's movements and always have, the question I get asked all the time is, so, what did they win, right? How much success did they have? And, and for this group, this movement in the United States alone, the success, though we still have such a long way to go, has been staggering. Between 2012 and 2016, the Fight for 15 and Walmart low-wage workers movements won themselves $61.5 billion in raises, which is 12 times what Congress awarded them the last time they raised the minimum wage in 2007. And that's through a variety of different means. It's through local ordinances, it's through state ordinances. They're not getting it, and it's through convincing private companies to make change. One of the things these new strikes have done is they've gone after really expensive branding practices, right? So not loving it is one of the slogans you see all over, right? I mean, it was the first global television campaign. McDonald's paid Justin Timberlake $6 million to sing I'm Loving It. And so there's a lot of that attempting to kind of undermine, there's a lot of attempting to undermine these corporate slogans as a way of getting companies to bend. And they have, in a lot of industries, private companies have raised their wage to $15 just as a way of sort of keeping this at bay. And we all know $15 is not enough to live on. I'm talking about it with these guys over dinner. $20 is the minimum. There's no county in the United States where you can shelter and clothe and feed 2 children for under $20 an hour, right? So it's not, $15 is not a living wage. But in 2012, the idea that you would double the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 in a few years seemed like totally crazy, right? No one believed it would happen. So their success in changing minds, so it takes place on many levels. They are interested in international organizing. For example, the garment trades, which are so heavily centered in Asia right now, they're elsewhere as well, but has spawned a group called the Asia Floor Wage. And the Asia Floor Wage is really interesting. It says there are 2 different standards. One is, they said you can't put a dollar label on it because the currency and the cost of living is so different in all of these different countries. So instead you say every job should pay enough to do what I just said, to clothe and feed 2 children and put a decent roof over their heads and have water, right? One of the big issues galvanizing this movement is water. And as we all know, it's not just a problem, it's not just a problem in Manila or Phnom Penh. It's a problem in Flint, Michigan, and in many parts of the United States. So water, this young man, what's your name?
Lauren.
Lauren?
Yep.
Yeah, what he said to me over dinner, he said, it just reached the point where you can't go down anymore. You've hit the bottom. And I think water is that moment. Water is that thing, right? If you don't have water, you have no choice but to organize. And so that's a lot of what has driven people. So Asia Floor Wage is one organization that's seeking to make a standard across the garment industry. And part of the reason they can organize is because these corporations are global. McDonald's is on 6 continents, right? H&M, right? These mega clothing corporations, Walmart, right? They can say, we want to create a standard across the industry. But they're also doing things like trying to get the UN, they're fasting, field workers are fasting in front of the United Nations right now. The people who pick tomatoes to try to get a fair food program that includes fighting sexual violence in the fields. Women field workers and garment workers have been trying to fight sexual violence on the job. And they want to get an International Labor Organization convention passed, because then each company, they can get their country to try to ratify it, right? And then it becomes law within their own country, right? If they have this global convention, either through the UN or International Labor Organization, then they can get individual countries to work on it. There have been successive global actions around this very issue, where women workers have walked off the job from one end of the planet to the other. Last November 25th, that's what they did. So I guess, so that's my answer, is they're working really, really small and all the way up. Really, really small is a problem because of, in this country, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Anybody know about them? You're nodding. Anyone wanna? This is a Koch brother creation that by 2011 had membership of 1/4 of all elected officials in the United States. And they introduced something called preemption bills, because this movement was having so much success getting cities and counties to pass the $15 wage. They introduced something called preemption bills into state legislatures. And what those bills said is that localities can't pass a minimum wage higher than the state. Right? And they introduced those bills, their legislators, many of them, introduced preemption bills and right to work bills, which make it harder to unionize, into state legislatures across the country 1,000 times between 2012 and 2016. So on the one hand, they're winning a lot, but what they're up against is tremendous. And so they're constantly shifting and trying to work on every level possible. I could read a little more, we could talk a little more. What would you guys like to do? Any thoughts?
Read a little bit more about it.
You want me to read a little bit more?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. This is your night. Okay. Here in the United States, I'll read this one. I like this little piece. This is a piece about this march, and it's called "This is What Solidarity Feels Like." And it gives you a sense of how the global movement spreads. When Cambodian garment workers won a wage increase in the fall of 2015, Kalpana Actor saw Bangladeshi garment workers smiling as they watched cell phone videos of celebrations in Phnom Penh. Massimo Frattini said he has seen European workers watching Fight for 15 videos on their phones. Cell phones have helped workers feel part of something global, the electricity of rebellion. But transnational movements predate cell service. Sociologist George Katsiafikas, who has studied the global protests of 1968 and the people power movements of the 1980s, says that uprisings are infectious. The pleasure of revolt sparks currents of change that spread across national borders. He calls this the Eros effect. A buzz sweeps marginalized communities, an elation at the possibility that they might be able to enact change. As people are transformed through insurgencies, he says they refuse to tolerate previously accepted forms of domination. Popular wisdom grows in each iteration of the movement's emergence. Ever new aspirations animate action. Adrenaline spreads grassroots protests from one city to the next, one country to another. Hope is an important and understudied political force. Amid genocidal wars, refugee crises, and violent repression, a disappearing middle class and a planet grown hotter, currents of hope began running around the world in the 2010s, animating worker movements and connecting them. And on days of global action, one can feel the electricity crackling. On April 15th, 2015, low-wage workers in 200 U.S. cities and in 40 countries on 6 continents struck and rallied for a living wage. They marched in New York, Boston, Los Angeles, Chicago, and hundreds of other American cities. They marched in London, Brussels, Paris, Stockholm, Manila, Seoul, Tokyo, Rio, Tegucigalpa, Buenos Aires, Brasilia, Cape Town, Freetown, and Accra. It wasn't only economic gains that moved them. These marchers sought to reoccupy cities where all but the wealthiest have been marginalized by rising costs, to make visible the people whose labor makes our cities run. While workers are relegated to far-flung fringe neighborhoods, that were once or marooned in bleak, poor ethnoburbs, cities that were once economically diverse, home to manufacturing as well as banking and luxury real estate, became sanitized and gentrified amusement parks for the rich. So this is probably a little too long piece to read, but suffice it to say that in this march, you had people from every background. This was a truly global city. In New York, you had Korean, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Afro-Caribbean, Polish and Bulgarian, Russian, Irish, Dominican, Mexican, indigenous Central American immigrants and their American kids marched. And American-born union workers marched too. Puerto Ricans, African Americans, Chinese, Irish, Italian. They made a conscious effort to come out from their far-flung homes. It took a leap of faith for them to come out into the light, says Dominican organizer Virgilio Aran, to lift their heads, to walk freely down the streets of the city center where they worked but could not afford to live. Undocumented workers well understand that employers pay them too little and work them too hard because they are sure that workers without green cards are too frightened to report abuses. Aran has fought for a long time to change that. On April 15, 2015, he walked with his wife and fellow activist Rosana Rodriguez, greeting marchers in emotion-filled Spanish, shaking hands and giving hugs. A few years earlier, the couple had founded the Laundry Workers Center to organize undocumented Spanish-speaking workers across New York. And they had a number of successes that I talk about in the book, organizing bakery workers, restaurant workers, people who their bosses didn't just, they weren't just sure that they wouldn't report the abuses because they were afraid they'd be turned in and deported, but also bosses who were warning that they'd hurt their families back home, right? Who knew something about their families in the DR and in Mexico and in Central America. So Aran and Rodriguez say that despite their gains, the successful strikes, the unions they've built, the most radical work they do is psychological. To transform scared workers into labor activists, organizers must help them overcome legitimate fears and anxieties. Undocumented workers must transcend lifetimes of being told they are good only for cheap labor, says Aran. To foster that, the LWC runs consciousness raising and peer education groups. I found this all over the world. Workers are teaching themselves. They're running their consciousness raising groups where they teach each other everything from how to not conceive babies to labor history to what their legal rights are to history of racism. Since so many of the workers are women, Aran says everyone must understand the history of sexism. Dominicans teach about white skin privilege in the DR and in the US. Racism affects our workers negatively, he says. We try to help them fight that feeling. When a worker feels strong enough to come into the light, Aran says, that's a breakthrough. If you're an undocumented immigrant, you get up every single day and you get on the train to go to work and someone might say, give me your papers. If you don't have documents, then you're facing deportation. To do that every day takes incredible courage, he says. You've made such hard choices to come to another country, to cross borders, to learn a new language, to adapt and find work and face deportation every day. When you realize that, he pauses, you understand that you're a superhero. It's my job to help workers find that feeling. Most undocumented immigrants are warned not to reveal their real names, says Aran. In the age of Donald Trump, those fears have deepened. But the only path to freedom, he teaches them, is to reject terror. When you no longer fear, he says, when you tell your own story, when you know your own history and that of the workers who have struggled before you, when you say your own name out loud, when you show your face, then you have power. Then you know that employers can't report you or they too will face government sanctions. Then intimidation in the workplace doesn't affect you so much. He takes a slow breath. Then you can fight back. And I go on to talk about these freedom schools that they run that are very much like the freedom schools of the civil rights movement where they teach each other. And then I talk a little bit here. I wanted to talk just about what that march felt like. So on that day, Laundry Workers Center activists joined the march in which more than half of the participants earned too little to feed their children. But for that day, they controlled the streets of Midtown Manhattan. They flooded Columbus Circle, dancing beneath the gates to Central Park, poured onto Broadway, marched to Times Square, singing and cheering. They said their names aloud. Blue Rainier, and you saw him, hundreds of fast food workers marched wearing Black Lives Matter, I Can't Breathe sweatshirts, tying the movement for higher wages to the struggle against police violence, highlighting the last words uttered by Staten Island street vendor Eric Garner as he was choked to death by police. It's the same struggle, says Rainier. We are the same people. We all want the same thing. We deserve dignity and a decent life. So a lot of marchers carried Ronald McDonald puppets. They waved the corporate clown high. In some versions, he wept in shame. McJobs cost us all, said a popular shirt. The McDonald's logo appeared on banners covered by the words, poverty wages, not loving it. High school students mugged for the camera. Wheelchair-bound veterans in neon green Our Walmart shirts wheeled alongside the marchers. Kids ran and laughed under signs that said everybody deserves respect. As we reached Times Square, daylight fading, city lights flickering on. Can you go back to the home health care workers? Let's see if we can get to them, because they're here. Good. City lights flickering on, hundreds of home health care providers clad in white lab coats began to sing and dance to the tune of When the Saints Go Marching In. With a Caribbean lilt, they sang, we're overworked and underpaid. All we want is $15. We're overworked and underpaid. They repeated it again and again, dancing and singing, block after block, humming, clapping, twirling. Tourists smiled and sang along. Twilight descended over Times Square. Electronic billboards flashed. And for a few minutes, on a warm spring evening, middle-aged immigrant, Black, Asian, and Latina home health care workers owned Broadway. The recognition came in a rush. It was the kind of feeling that enables people to keep mounting protests. Marching en masse, they were more than low-wage workers. Fear was replaced by strength. Hunger was sated by solidarity. Against the twilit sky, I saw an untold number of hands raise their cell phones to record and upload videos to social media. People shared and commented on cell phone videos of sister marches in London, Tokyo, Manila, Nairobi, and Seoul. One woman excitedly started showing around a photograph of a march in Dhaka. There, that's in Bangladesh, there a young woman held a sign that said, Bangladeshi workers support the $15 minimum wage. She'd photographed herself and posted a selfie, as so many teenage girls do every day. So that was just give you a little sense of the feeling of solidarity. There are many stories that are part of this. There are the young people here. Fight for 15 is heavily influenced by the Black freedom struggle of the 1960s, and these young workers feel themselves part of that movement. And indeed, sometimes they're taught by that movement. I interviewed one young woman who had just come back from a meeting of 500 of these fast food workers who were being tutored in unionism and civil disobedience by survivors of the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers strike, where Martin Luther King had gone to march on the day that he was killed. So they are very much, they feel like they want to know whose shoulders they stand on, and that's the language that they use. And they call themselves the New Civil Rights Movement. And many of these young workers quote everywhere in this movement the words of the 1960s Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party organizer Fannie Lou Hamer, who said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. She isn't always quoted, but you see that everywhere. I cannot tell you the number of Black fast food workers who said that to me, the marches where that is being carried. So, you know, as people learn history from each other and from some of these older activists, it really fuels, you know, this movement across the generations. So, other thoughts? I can read more, we can talk, I can sign. It's yes.
I'm just, pardon my ignorance, but what is healthcare access like the lowest paid workers of these like mega corporations?
Well, there's none. I mean, these guys are unionized, right? They're local 1199 SEIU. So these guys, one of the things that really moved me is the extent to which unionized workers have gone out on a limb again and again, not only to give money to this movement, but also they're waging hunger strikes, they're joining them and supporting them in every way. So these guys have decent health care, who are unionized. But again, the vast majority of low-wage workers are not unionized. There have been some big successes, though. Airport workers have flooded into unions in a way that we have seen in no other industry in this country in many, many years. End of 2016, you got thousands and thousands of airport workers in the country's 20 biggest airports flooding in into unions. So there is a return. Those folks have health care. Everybody else has nothing. They have no health care. And in many countries, like in Bangladesh and in the Philippines and in Cambodia and many other parts of the world, across South Africa, you know, the condition of loans by the global banks, by the World Trade, by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, is that you privatize public services and let corporations come in and profit from them. So I met this really wonderful group of young women organizers in Phnom Penh. They organize garment workers, but they also organize against privatization. And they do so through a women's rock group called Messenger Band. And Messenger Band takes the words of garment workers and they bring them, put them in songs and they sing them all over. But one of their songs is Suffer from Privatization, and they go around the country, and it's very dangerous because Hun Sen, like Duterte, does not hesitate to assassinate leaders in public spaces. But they go around the country and sing this song about how we must shake off these chains of privatization, right? We must, again have healthcare and again have water. So it's a very, and when I say global struggle in this particular context, I don't just mean around the world. I mean, it's a struggle about everything, right? It's a struggle about housing and water and education and healthcare. So that's really an important issue, because in a lot of these countries, people did have healthcare, right? The loss of healthcare is really in the last 30 or so years. Yeah.
How do you see these workers and these movements interacting with the fate of organized labor, which seems to be continuing to decline?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking also of how, if there's a lesson in the West Virginia teachers strike, a wildcat strike, and maybe there's a silver lining in the decline of labor somewhere, that it will force maybe a more militant movement to rise up.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happened is that a lot of people who are going back into unions were inspired by some of these young people who were not originally and still aren't unionized, like the fast food workers. So I spoke to these two airport workers. I'll see if we can find them. Keep going, keep going, keep going. There they are, Prince Jackson and Knut Drayton. And they said, these fast food workers are members of our own families. Right? We've all worked in fast food, and many young people in our families worked, and they had the courage to do this. They thought, we're older, we have the chance of unionizing, and these guys did. They unionized 8,000 workers in Newark, LaGuardia, and JFK airports, which was the first time they'd been represented by a union. And so I think that the courage of these young people, the humor, the civil disobedience actions, and some of their victories, are, like, at first people said, oh my God, SEIU. I mean, I asked union officials this. I said, how can you keep doing this? Because if they don't join unions, you're not getting dues, right? So how do you have the money to keep doing it? And they said, because the view of unions in the United States had gotten so bad, right, that the only way that we could help improve that is say we stand for all workers, not just our members, right? We're going to try to do something that's good for everybody. But they had faith that it was going to start to bring people into unions, and as it didn't, and then since the fall of 2016, it is. And I think that I think these teacher strikes are a very interesting example of the potential for revival because public sector unions are the last strong unions in the United States, and that's who Scott Walker went after in Wisconsin, and that's who the Koch brothers are going after, and. So, these teachers, I talked to a teacher in Kentucky the other day who told me the same thing the fast food workers told me, is what do we have to lose? In Oklahoma, gas station attendants earn more than public school teachers, right? And so I think that this feeling, come back to your statement, we've hit bottom, right? I think people feel like they have nothing to lose. And the militants is interesting, right? New Jersey teachers went on strike this morning. So I think teachers may be the next wave of this. You had a question.
Oh, you spoke at the beginning about in Florida that with the fast food workers there will also be college professors.
Yeah.
What is the condition of, how are college professors part of this?
Okay, because what happened is that jobs like mine, jobs with tenure, jobs with security, were won through college professors union organizing in the 1930s. That's, I learned that my own institution, Dartmouth, didn't even have permanent jobs for professors until, they organized in the early part of the 20th century. And so when I came out into the market, it was like 50-60% of jobs were real jobs. They were they were jobs where you could get security, where you could, have a decent wage. it's now, in the last 10, 15 years, again, we weren't looking. Part of this, what was revelatory for me about doing this book is so much change when I wasn't looking. My adult life. It's now 75% contract workers. 25% of teaching PhDs, 25% of the people who teach your children in this country on the college level are on food stamps and Medicaid. Because they're paid course to course, no job security, gotta go begging, people, sometimes like, even in rural institutions like in mine, you can have people who work there a really long time and they're still going begging course to course. I mean, Dartmouth's better than others because we're in the middle of New Hampshire and so they, but in Boston where, as people like to say, you can, throw a snowball and hit a PhD. It's really bad. 70% of teaching faculty at Tufts are contract workers. They organized and they're starting to get, some security. But no, it's unbelievable. You've got college professors living in their cars. You've got people. University of New Hampshire at Durham, not very long ago, was paying $2,000, $3,000 a course. I interviewed a guy in Florida who taught 12 courses a year, commuting between 3 different campuses in 24/7 rush hour traffic, and he made $30,000 a year. For 12 courses a year, that's 3 times what I teach. So, I mean, the situation, college professors, it's now a poverty wage job. I was just talking to someone about, who taught at a graduate program. We don't have grad students, but you can't in good conscience tell people to go to graduate school and get PhDs unless you don't pay for it and it's just about education. But you certainly can't tell someone go into debt because you'll get a job. But again, all of this was changed 100 years ago. In Bangladesh and the whole rest of the world, it is 1911, right? And we're starting all over again. And, with tenure, with job security, with overtime. Someone was talking to me about it just yesterday. It was about just a, cafe job in Boston where everybody is required, they do actually give people longer term jobs, but everybody's required to clock out, right at the 8 hours, right? And then clock back in so that they don't have to pay overtime. Right, so that they, and then there are other situations where people get fired, so they have no security, no seniority, and then they bring them back on and say you're just a new worker. I mean, there's all these kinds of tactics, but I think I end the book with some hopeful examples because I think it's really necessary for us to have hope, and there are some interesting things going on around the country and the world that are worth thinking about. One of them is out of this really brilliant creative think tank in Los Angeles called the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy. And they recognize that city governments, goes back to your question about how you go on all levels, that city governments are pretty much the most progressive governments in the country right now. And that city governments spend a lot of money on public transportation. A lot of money, billions, on public transportation. And so they have negotiated deals with, at this point they have Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, the 3 biggest urban labor markets in the country. And the deal is that when they negotiate with a company to build the new subway cars, or the new buses, or the new fleets of garbage trucks, that you only get a contract if you say you're going to make the trucks in the city, make the trains in the city, right? If you are going to allow workers to unionize, and if you're going to hire people who are historically chronically underemployed. So women of color, veterans, ex-cons, disabled, and so a certain percentage of the people you hire, like I think 40%, have to be from those groups. And you also have to show the environmental impact on the city. So they've done a remarkable thing. I mean, the trucks that used to go from the port in Los Angeles were they were one of the single biggest contributing factors to Los Angeles' terrible air. They've got electric trucks going now, and they just did one of these electric truck contracts, and they're hiring all these folks and totally reviving this, dead city outside of LA. So for all of the rhetoric of the Trump administration about bringing manufacturing back to the United States, it's actually folks in this movement who are bringing unionized manufacturing back to these cities. So that's one example. There are farm collectives, there are, since it's sold in a bookstore and we were just talking about it, I'll give you this one example, and people are starting to look tired, so maybe I'll sign books unless you have other questions. This is something called the Villa Altagracia Project, and it was a collaboration of United Students Against Sweatshops and these Dominican garment workers and this guy, Phil Knight, who made uniforms for the National Hockey League, and he had some tragedies in his family. And so he said, you know what, Knight's Apparel can't just be about making money. I have to do something else. So he took a town in the Dominican Republic, Villa Altagracia, where the workers had been trying to unionize in these garment factories owned from outside the country for years. And they came to the U.S. and they got support from consumers, and and they won eventually, and they were able to unionize. And then what happens in the garment trade happened, and which was that the company just left. They closed the shop, they left, they went somewhere else. So Knight said, you know what, I want to show that you can do that. You can have these factories be union, give you workers health care, housing with running water, and electricity, and they did. And what's really interesting is they now make logo wear because of student pressure for more than 800 colleges and universities across the United States, and they're marketed again by a socially responsible corporation, Barnes & Noble, which has decided they're going to market these Villa Altagracia products in bookstores all across the country. So I think there are a lot of examples of positive change that can be reproduced. And all the studies of the Villa Altagracia project said, if you can do it on that scale, then certainly H&M can do it, right? Certainly Zara can do it. So that's, and the way that those big companies are being pushed, and this is the last example I'll give you of a very successful new model that I think is the wave of the future. Kalpana Actor, after the Rana Plaza factory collapse in 2013, which is the worst disaster in the history of the garment industry, 10 times the death toll of Triangle, they created something called the Bangladesh Fire and Safety Accord, and it brought together corporations, consumers, and workers. And what they got was 225 corporations around the world who make clothing to sign an agreement which said, we will pay a little more to the factories where clothing is made safely, and that little more has to be used for two things: bringing up workers' salaries and fixing safety issues in the buildings. And the union is going to choose who inspects these buildings. It's not going to be Walmart or Gap, which insist that they can inspect the buildings themselves. And this is quite remarkable. The companies actually agree to be sued in their own countries if they go back on this agreement. So these things are called worker-led social responsibility codes. They've transformed tomatoes in the United States. Ben & Jerry's just signed one in the dairy industry in Vermont. And so there's a lot of hope out of all of this, for change, and a lot of really good models. And so that's what I closed the book with, and so that we could sort of pay attention to these models and think about reproducing them. I've talked long enough. You're tired. It's late. Thank you so much for coming out.